Thank you for coming. I'm going to speak for 40 minutes, maybe slightly less. There's a chance to ask questions at the end, or if you get really agitated, just wave at me during the middle of it. What I'm going to do is just show you some pictures and talk about them. They're pictures from 4 books. They're about the state of the world, but mostly about the state of Britain and about how we look at things and try to measure them to understand what's going on. What you're seeing behind me is a graph with a little red dot moving up. It's a measure of emissions of carbon in the world. It looks pretty bad. If you look very carefully, you can see when it goes up slightly faster, when it goes up slightly more slowly. I'm going to show you the same data, exactly the same data, but in another way in a minute, which demonstrates how you can look at things very differently. And I'm going to tell you the good news, what I think is good news. So the book this comes from is a book about global trends, looking at about 62 different variables. Turned out that only 4 of them were accelerating. Most things in the world are slowing down. That's why the book's called Slow Down. The 4 things which were accelerating, so not just going up, but going up faster, are our emissions of carbon, then temperature on the planet, number of university students. That'll be most of you, I suspect. But that's going to come to an end because it can't carry on accelerating forever. And the number of flights that people take in the world isn't just going up, it's going up faster each year, bar the pandemic. But every year, more people are born who are never going to fly. So I'm interested in inequalities. Most of the flights in the world are taken by people who fly a lot. So I promised you the same data, drawn a different way. There you go. So suddenly you get a different impression. What you can see there is that it's not going up steadily at all. The horizontal axis is showing you the speed of change. And you can see that in recessions, in the early 80s, in the early 90s, it went down. During economic booms, worldwide it went up. It would have gone down again after 2018, down dramatically with that pandemic. The pandemic's the biggest thing that's happened since the Second World War. So it's a way of trying to understand that changes in emissions of carbon are not inevitable. Right? That actually changes very quickly. Depends a lot on economic circumstances. In the future, it's going to depend on shifting away from coal, away from gas, towards solar. You, people. Right? I'm not showing you the normal graph of this because the normal graph of this looks like a ski slope, with the population of the planet being very, very low and then zooming up from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 billion really quickly. Looks out of control. But here we're looking at world population with the horizontal axis showing the rate of change and the vertical axis showing the number of people. We're at 2024, still going up, right? That dot's still rising, but it's rising more slowly than it was before. This data is from 2017, so it's out of date. It's been updated about 3 times since. 2 times ago, the UN, who produced this data, these are the official global population estimates of the planet, said actually, it's not going to be like this. It's going to peak in the year 2086. And then in July of this year, they revised their figures again and said it's going to peak in the year 2084. The population of the world will reach a maxima in the year 2084. How old are you going to be in 2084? Can any of you work it out? Who's quick? How old? 77? 79? 76? Okay. If the UN are right, you are going to be the first human beings in the history of our species to live on a planet with the number of human beings going down. The first ever. Right? Now that is quite incredible. That's because people have been given the freedom or demanded the freedom or claimed the freedom to choose how many children they have. And when they get to choose, turns out on average they want slightly less than 2. And this is a good news story. We never thought 20, 30 or 40 years ago it was possible. Let me show it you another way. Log scale on the vertical axis now. I know we've got some economics students in the room. They like log scales, maybe. Change again on the horizontal axis. And you'll see there's 2 little blips before the current change. In none of these cases did the population of the world go down. It didn't go down when the plague of St. Justinian's came. It didn't come down when the Black Death came. The population of the planet as a whole probably didn't go down when we turned up in 1492 in 3 little boats and spread old world diseases throughout the New World, which killed tens of millions of people over the next few decades. It didn't go down, although the rise of population slowed, when we, and it was more us than anybody else, the English, invaded 90% of the countries of the world, the current members of the United Nations, destroyed their social systems and took over and colonized their countries, which weren't countries. But it had a dent. And then the population explosion occurred because if you destroy the civilizations of places, the ways in which people control their societies ends. If you want an extreme example, the most sustainable civilization on Earth was in Australia, Aboriginal, utterly and completely destroyed when Captain Cook arrived there. And when you destroy order, you destroy a civilization, people have more children. When they're insecure, they have more children. When there's a war, they have more children. If you lock them up and put a fence around them, they have more children. If you give them stability, though, social security, pensions, an idea that the future will be okay, and the means to have fewer children, and women are allowed to decide what they want rather than men, you get fewer children, which is what we're heading rapidly towards now. This matters because across the world, you lot should be enormously more valuable because there are fewer of you, far fewer of you. At the moment, we have people who are petrified about young adults coming across the channel in small boats. The interesting question is which part of Europe is going to first of all realize that it wants people to come because there aren't enough people. The second city of Finland, Turku, recently celebrated its highest ever population due to the migration of immigrants to it. The Finns tend to be quite clever. They know what's a good thing. And in a way, another good story. Although not necessarily a good story, we're living through the 6th largest extinction of species that we've measured on the planet. We weren't around for the other 5. We can just see that they became extinct because they're not in the shale, they're not in the fossils. And this is the rates of extinction of large animals since the 1970s. And the good news is that it's stopped. It's kind of not that good news, because if it hadn't stopped, we'd all be dead, because we're a large animal too. But 70% of the large animals measured by the Zoological Society in London are now extinct. It's too late, they're gone. You can't bring them back again. There isn't a Jurassic Park method. But it was the rarer ones, the ones on the small islands, the dodos and so on, that went first. But at least it has stopped. There are still extinctions, but the rate is now much lower than it was because we are observing them much more carefully and because we have killed off the ones that are most likely to die. You also get new species occurring. That's the end of the first part of my talk. 3 more bits. My main work is about the UK. I don't really want it to be about the UK. The rest of the world is much more interesting. The rest of the world is much more exciting. The rest of the world is a much more good news story. The rest of the world has incredible improvements in human health going on. Places like Finland have achieved the lowest child infant mortality rate ever in the history of our species, lowest number of people grieving. The improvements in access to education around the planet are stunning. The uptake of green energy is unbelievable around the world. The changing position of women is increasing at a rate you simply couldn't have imagined just a few years ago. The world is full of good news stories. The amount of violence in the world is increasing, but only slowly, and is nothing like it was in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s. I can do a very good glass half full story about the planet, even given loss of biodiversity and climate change. Sadly, we don't live in one of those places. The slides I'm going to show you next are about why the UK in particular is strange, is odd, and is not in a good place. But the good news, the hope from this is, it's almost certainly going to get better. If you were to take Europe, roughly 30 countries, and treat those 30 countries as a class of 30 children, then in many ways we would be at the bottom of the class. The good news, if you're at the bottom of the class, is there's only one way, and it's up. Whereas if you're one of the countries that does best in the world, there's only one other way, which is down. I'll try and convince you, or at least persuade you of this argument. We tend to tell ourselves a story, by the way, that we're great. We're brilliant. We win lots of medals in the Olympics. We invented everything. We're like a mini USA. You know, everything is great here, so it can be a shock. First of all, the context or the background to this. The UK, but most of the world, most of the rich world at least, was incredibly unequal 100 years ago. These lines are the proportion of income taken by various groups. At the top, you've got the 1% of the 1%. Think the book Brideshead Revisited, think Lady Marchmont in that, think the great country houses, think people with 400 servants. The very richest 100 years ago had an income from their plantations and other overseas investments, largely 400 times the average income. The most common job for women 100 years ago in the UK was to be a servant. The worst thing about being a servant is you can't have children, because they make a lot of noise. That, from 100 years ago, almost exactly, right, 1914/1918, came plummeting down. Not just in this country, but across Europe. It took a bit longer in the USA. Absolutely plummeting down. Because a war began in Europe 100 years ago that was supposed to last a few weeks and lasted for years. And wars, particularly that first modern war, was expensive. And it had to be paid for. And only one group had the money, the top lines up there. And so they were taxed, and income tax came in, and wealth tax came in, and inheritance tax was increased. And people also protested. In Glasgow, they demanded rent controls, and the rents began to be controlled so that landlords couldn't exploit them. We had rent control all the way through to when I was a student in the 1980s. Right? The world utterly changed. It's a log scale again. If I took the log scale off, you'd see just how much more dramatic it was. By the time I was your age, or a bit younger than you, the UK was the second most equal country in Europe to Sweden of the large countries. I grew up in a Nordic country. I grew up 10 miles north in Cowley and Risinghurst, in a place with full employment, really well-paid jobs, 40,000 people working in a car factory being paid double what a servant would get paid, so why would you be a servant in a college anymore? Where almost every family had a holiday every year, and the normal thing was to go camping, but if you're really rich, you put a caravan on the back of your car and went to the south of France. I can wax lyrical about the 1970s and early 1980s. It all changed in the late 1970s, early 80s. It goes up just as fast as it's gone down, and it's now faltering again. And as you'll see a bit later, that rise in inequality, the increased gaps between people, was faster than in any other country in Europe. So that by 2009, we'd become more unequal than Portugal, And then around about 2014, we become as unequal as Bulgaria, and we're probably now the most economically unequal country by income in all of Europe. But why does it matter? I mean, somebody has to be the most unequal. Aren't we just rewarding talent and ability and hard work? And we've just got a lot of lazy people. The problem with this is that it isn't simply that high economic inequality means that most people have very little. I'm well high up in the top 10%. My group, the highest 10% of households, we take 40% of all income. We leave the rest of the population with just 60% to get by on. The problem is that those of us in control, which is almost entirely the top 10%, then make decisions for others over how we're going to organise or run society. It's always the best off 10% who are in control, largely the best off 1% who are in control. But look at these enormous differences in this graph of public spending, which is the same as taxation, give or take borrowing. The figures come from the IMF. Every country in the world tells the IMF what it's going to spend in future, so you can look at what's going to happen. And you can see we're the red line at the bottom. And it's true to say, bar the jumps, that our taxes are now higher than they've been for 70 years. But they're also lower than everywhere else in Europe, bar the two countries I haven't included, which are Switzerland and Ireland, because of slightly dodgy reasons. Switzerland has the pharmaceutical industry concentrated in it, so its GDP looks really high, making its public spending look low. Ireland is a home to US corporations because it charges very little tax. But other than that, here's the rest. Now, I could tell you a cynical story, that the rest of Europe is a wasteland, that if you go to Belgium and see Brussels, if you went to France, if you went to Finland, if you went to these countries, you'd see this terrible wasteland where nothing is working because they tax too much, and the people are just dying in the streets in gutters because it can't possibly operate like that. But of course that isn't true. We're the country where more people are dying in gutters than anywhere else. We have the highest rates of homelessness. In 2018, after Manchester, Oxford had the second highest rate of homelessness deaths. Right? Several people who went to school with me died on the streets of Oxford. When I was a child, there were no homeless young people. There were 2 or 3 old men in Bond Square, and that was it. The only place in Europe you will not find homeless people now is Finland, because they decided to have a policy in Finland of housing people first and eradicating homelessness, and they did it. How did Finland do it? I'm waffling on too long. I wrote a book on it with a Finn, but they came here in the 1960s to look at our education system, copied it, implemented it, made Finland one of the most equal parts of Europe, and changed the attitudes of people in Finland and decided that nobody is going to sleep rough on the streets of Finland. They had tens of thousands, and it's very cold in winter in Finland. Luckily, the public toilets were heated. They now have almost nobody. They get very annoyed when I say this, because the Finns go, oh no, we've got 7 homeless people, we know who they are, in the whole country. Right? The gap between France and the UK is several national health services. In terms of geography, this is fascinating. We're running an experiment. What happens if you do things differently? Stephanie Flanders, former BBC economics correspondent, business editor, now at Bloomberg, was at JPS, John Morgan. John Murdoch of the Financial Times, I'll let you read the quotes. These stories about the UK are no longer told on the fringe. Right. It's a shock, and because we're such a divided country, you can live in parts of the country and not see the other parts, and so you don't realise, because you don't see, that the poorest fifth of people in the UK are poorer than the majority of the poorest fifth in all of Eastern Europe. You won't see it with your eyes. I would never have known. I grew up in a utopian Oxford in the 70s or 80s if I hadn't gone to the University of Newcastle in 1986 and stayed there for 10 years. At exactly the same time as I left Oxford, little Danny goes north, little Dave and little Boris and little Yvette came to my city and were all university students and then went to London, and they saw a different Britain. Right? So you can't just use your eyes, you have to look at the numbers. We have the lowest social security benefits in Europe, and you have to fill in a form if you want universal credit, that when printed out and printed onto a silk sheet for an art exhibition is 17 feet long. Okay. Going to try and get slightly more optimistic, and then more optimistic again. Book number 3. This came out on the 26th of September this year. It has taken me 30 years to realize that people don't want to look at graphs unless you force them to in a lecture theatre. Right? So I tried to write a book with hardly any graphs in it about 7 children, and I also made up the lives of 7 children. These children were born in 2018 when there were 14 million children in the country. I divide them into 7 groups of 2 million, and I take the middle child from each one. I order the 14 million children by the household income of their parents. The shock is that the poorest child, they're not going to a food bank, they're not homeless. 1 million children are worse off than them. But their disposable income after paying their rent is £118 a week, which, if you go back 100 years, was £1 a week. And people were writing books about poverty called Round About £1 a Week on living on the £1 a week 100 years ago. So for the very poorest seventh of young people in Britain, nothing has got that much better. In particular, because above them, they've seen others get more. Yes, they have access to a health service, and yes, they'll have a mobile phone, but a mobile phone is now essential. 100 years ago, we argued about whether people should be allowed to afford a penny postage stamp. That's the income distribution with 100 lines of families with children in the UK, and that's our 7 children. Now, this is about typical children. I wasn't a typical child. I grew up in the 1%. Remember, I grew up in the very equitable 1970s and 1980s. How did I get to be in the 1%, just in the 1%? For the same reason that Rishi Sunak did. His father was a doctor. My father was a doctor. But in the 1970s and 80s, being a doctor would put you just in the top 1%, being paid by the NHS, because other people didn't make a huge amount of money. Rishi Sunak was just in the 1% because his mum ran a pharmacy. And he put the pharmacy and the surgery together, and he just about made it. Just enough money to get to Winchester. He very usefully married somebody at the very top of the income scale, so he kind of serves as a useful example if you want to know what poor and rich at the very top is. But that's a world away from this. 7% of children are better off than our richest 7th child, if you're following me. Just 7%, including people like me. But those 7% of children take 33% of all income. Their families take 33%. So they're the grey lines zooming off up to the top. For this book, I forget about them. And I forget about the poorest 7% as well. So it's about the group who are typical of people. But even then, because we're the most unequal country in Europe, you can see that 3 of the children's families are getting by on less money than child number 7 all put together. Who is child number 7? She's called Gemma. I'll give them names. They're Anna, Brandon, Candice, David, Emily, Freddie, and Gemma. In my weird head, they're real. I spent 3 years writing this book. By the way, fiction's really difficult. Non-fiction's easy, you just look at the truth. Fiction's hard because you've got to make up things and then stay consistent. Gemma's mum and dad run a corner shop. They run it well. They have a disposable income of £50,000 a year, £25,000 each after paying tax, paying for housing. So the rich kid, mum and dad, run a corner shop. They could marginally just afford to send Gemma to a private school. But she has a sister. And if they do send her to a private school, they'll have no money for anything else. Right? And this is how Britain is. Why is the situation as bad as it is now? Because of what's happened recently. In 2008, we had a financial crash, a crash that occurred across the world, but was particularly bad in the USA and particularly bad in Britain because we had so much more banking than other countries. Real incomes fell after 2008. People became absolutely poorer. It began to recover, but never quite got back to 2008. And then when the cost of living crisis occurred, real incomes plunged down again. So that graph is showing you the biggest wage stagnations of the last century. In this century, you have to go back to 1798 for the only wage freeze that's been longer than the current one in British history. And we can only do that because the Bank of England is obsessed with long-term data series. Right? So you have spent all your lives in the biggest wage freeze since 1798. To you, this is normal. People don't get better off on average anymore. That isn't true on mainland Europe, and it's a shock. The second graph there is just about the income inequalities and how they altered. So my childhood is spent in that very low period, then that huge rise as those with money got more money and those without it didn't, and then we've plateaued since the late 1990s. Nothing changed very much. But when nothing changes very much, other things do alter. This is perhaps the most shocking graph, so I'm going to show it you twice. This one here is the United Nations report. They produce a report every few years. They've been doing it for decades. On every country in the world, they can measure child poverty in an accurate way, according to their definition. And it's a really good news story. Remember, I can give you hope for the world, right? Look at those decreases. This is in 7 years. Child poverty has fallen by a third at most, by a quarter, or by at least a fifth in the majority of countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, because remittances have been sent back and people who are poor haven't had children because they've left to move west if they can. Right? The child poverty story for the world is incredibly good until you look up and then you see a few countries have gone the other way. Now, those countries include places like Switzerland and Norway, which have some of the lowest rates of child poverty ever seen, so a small rise doesn't actually mean very much, although they're incensed by it in Norway, which is partly why Norway has the lowest child poverty rate in the world, because they get really angry when it rises. But at the top is us. And we've had the biggest increase in child poverty in the last 7 years, measured, already starting from one of the worst rates in Europe. Right? Absolute disaster. That's all you can say. To an extent where children are now getting shorter. Began in 2010, but the children were born in 2005, so you can blame the new Labour government partly. I would. Annoys them. Gordon Brown was Chancellor when this started. Children getting shorter is a very safe measure of things getting worse because it relies on an average of all of them. Now, this isn't due to lots of short people turning up, which, you can see why people think this. It partly was in Germany because Merkel at one point, when a 14, 15-year-old girl burst into tears on her on telly, decided to allow over 1 million Syrian refugees in, half of whom were children from a war. That does have a slight dent. You can see the effect on Germany. We didn't do that. We take hardly any refugees. Our young people became shorter and shorter because they were worse fed. Because that's what a cost of living crisis and a wage stagnation and high inequality means. Less nutrition. You just measure the heights and they get shorter. The USA is doing badly as well, but we shouldn't take happiness from that. I'm going to click quickly through 2 slides just looking at elections, just to try to get you to look at elections in a different way. Each square here is 1 million people. I think there were 66 million people at the time of the 2019 election. Obviously, the children can't vote, but I think they should still be included in the slide. One day you might be allowed to. It keeps on being proposed that you lot should be allowed to vote. But they're the pink ones. You can see the Labour votes by age as you go down. Each of these age bands contains 6 million people. And you can see you have to get up to age 43 before you get a block of 1 million Conservative voters. So that's your 2019 general election. Let's go forward, if you're very quick, to the next one. And this is the election of July of this year. And the shock of politicians when the election happened was about how few people voted. Less than in 2019. Fewer people voted Labour than in 2019, despite Labour doing really well for MPs. Fewer people voted for the Liberals, despite Ed Davey turning out to be a lovely bloke who goes on roller coasters and has a brilliant backstory. Right. Fewer people voted Conservative, hardly surprising after 3 different switches of prime ministers and lots of parties during the pandemic. Reform came along. The election was probably held when it was, because if they'd waited 2 months, Reform would have done so much better. It's a scared, fractured nation with a politics all over the place. In 2014, our Conservative Party left the Conservative grouping in the EU and joined a group which included Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, who verge on fascism. They're far right. In European mainland terms, our Conservative Party is far right. The parties to the right of it are far, far right. The Labour Party is not a social democratic party, but a Merkel-style, well, actually to the right of Merkel. Right? All our politics shifted to the right. When you become more unequal, that's what happens. When we became more equal from 1914 onwards, all our politics shifted to the left. The Conservative governments, 1950, 51, 55, 59, built more council houses than Labour. Talked about one nation. Your political parties tend to be quite close to each other. You think if you live in a country they're very different, but they tend to be close and they all move together. They may all be moving slowly back, possibly. There's the graph again, just because I do think it matters. You know, this is the United Nations official measure and tally published to tell countries how they're doing. And we're at the top of it. And these are the inequality indices, and they're sloping downwards. Inequality is falling in most of Europe and most of the world, within most countries, most of the time. Right? It's a good news story. There's annoying Bulgaria. Bulgaria really annoys me. They also had 3 sets of prime ministers in the last few years, but they at least had an election to change them. And there's us at the very top. When you're very divided, you don't operate efficiently. Last book. Let's think of any questions. So, I got sick of writing books about the UK. It gets depressing. But decided to still do a depressing topic. And the question I set myself was, what will be the next big crisis in the world? What will be the thing that people worry about most in future? Now, I can't know that, of course, but it's an interesting question to address. And it means that you worry about what are the current crises and what do people currently worry about in the world. And what you discover is they worry about different things to you. Those are the chapters, so you get an idea of where the book's going. That's a graph of how many articles in the leading sociology journal in America mention the word inequality over time. And you can see, people are beginning to work out inequality might matter. You get bored of it. But it's discovering that when people are more equal in relatively affluent countries, like Japan and the Nordic states, and there are 5 countries of Europe which are more equal than the Nordic states, and there are now 5 countries in Europe which are almost as equal as Norway and Finland and Sweden, including France and Germany. So we have 15 countries in Europe which are remarkably equal. When people are more equal and live lives more similar to each other, they get on with each other better and organise things better and make their society work better. And when they're divided, they make it work really badly, so you have no rail system in the USA. This is the increase in the use of the word crisis up to 2019. After 2019, of course, it will go mad, because people really panic when a pandemic comes along. But you can see the increase. So you're probably immune to the word crisis because you just hear it all the time. But it wasn't always used. When you ask people what the biggest worry or concern is in their country, they don't say climate change. That's the short most important thing. Climate change was the 6th chapter in this book because it is that unimportant to most people. And by most people, I mean the world's middle class, because poor people don't fill in surveys. Climate change is of most interest to the rich because they don't have other things to necessarily concern them. Inflation, number 1, poverty and social inequality, number 2. Ipsos surveys of over 30 countries in the world consistently. You put inflation and poverty and inequality together, and they're related. We wouldn't worry about inflation if we could afford stuff. And you just see it's number 1 in the world in terms of most people's concerns. After that, unemployment. Right? And people who don't have to fear unemployment often forget that most people fear unemployment in rich countries still. Crime and violence, and you can read down the list. Not many more slides to go. Things you didn't know. People don't live longer in the United States, despite being much richer. Complicated graph, but essentially that's what it shows. And despite spending enormous amounts of money on healthcare, and even the richest 1% in the USA don't live longer than in England. And remember that we have some of the worst health in Europe now. If you were a group of American students, I couldn't do this. What I'd have to do to a group of American students, which is now almost cliched, is you give them a lecture about how wonderful the USA is, and then you set them an exercise where you ask the American students to tell you, why does America have the best students in the world in terms of their ability in maths and literature and problem solving? Why does America, the United States, have the lowest infant mortality in the world? Why does America have the highest life expectancy? Why does America have the best crime system where so few people are in prison? Why? And you can do this, it's quite remarkable. And you do get faces that go, oh, yes, yeah, that sounds good, my country's great. And then you send the students away to produce you an essay about why America's so good on these things. And then they come back and say, they found it was the opposite, and you go, yes. Because brought up in a culture with a flag on the wall and number 1 in the world. You are number 1 in the world if you're the richest and you have 10 fleets, 3 of which are virtual, and you can bomb any other country out of existence. Yes, you're number 1 in one way, but not if you have the highest rate of eviction of women, 2 million people in prisons, opiates being used by the middle classes commonly. The most common way in which you're going to die around my age is you're going to use a gun. It'll be your own gun. It's not somebody else who shoots you. But if you don't, anyway, I won't try and depress you, but it is not a good place. And that's just the numbers. And this graph is showing you the number of households that have to skip food. Okay? Not long. Worldwide issues. War, crime and violence. War is a particular worry for people. Not on the top of people's minds, unless they're near to a war which has been going on. It's a worry for people of my generation because all around this county, when I was your age, there were cruise missiles. We were basically where the war was going to happen. We were taught about the 4-minute warning, hiding under tables. If we heard the sirens go off, the Americans were here in large numbers because the war would be fought across Europe, and it would be a nuclear war. Very luckily, in the 1980s, people took government-published reports on what the effects of a bomb would be, government published reports about which the targets were in the UK they thought that Russia would hit, put the two together and worked out that 30 million people would be dead or dying within 2 weeks of a nuclear war. Then Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan began to negotiate peace, and we got rid of 90% of our nuclear weapons. There were lots of good news stories that we don't tell enough. Those circles are drawn in proportion to the number of people who've died in wars and war-related deaths around the world since 1989. It's pretty stark. I'm running out of time, so I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions of that. Just think of the places where many people die that we don't tell the stories of, what the largest circles have in common with each other. There is one circle which will have doubled in size in the last 12 months, but it's not that big to begin with compared to others. The number of war deaths is rising slowly at the moment. It had been falling. Okay. Almost at the end. Just 2 or 3 to go. Conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are fascinating. This comes from a YouGov poll of conspiracy theories, where the lovely thing about the poll was that they included a theory. They asked people, do you believe in aliens, the moon landings were fake, those kind of things. Apologies to anybody who believes the moon landings are fake, so I completely respect your opinion. But they included that Trump colluded with the Russians over the election as a conspiracy theory, which later turned out to be true. Anyway, adults who believed that a single secretive group run the world. You've got to be really careful how you ask the questions, because you can see the proportions there who believe this. And on one side, this is a conspiracy theory of me and my mates. I would like to think I'm part of this group, by the way. You know, we get together in the pub tonight, and I talk to Keith, and Keir, and Rachel, and Sue Gray, and we decide how to do things, right? On the other hand, most decisions are made by people in secret at the top. So the wording wasn't great, but there you go. Carbon emissions. The next graph is better, so let's show you that one. And we're almost at the end. 1 slide to go. Really good news. Most people on the planet hardly emit any carbon. And even if their lives are improved dramatically, they won't emit that much. Again, it's a log scale. You've got to go up to the richest, only 770,000 people, to find the really excessive carbon use. We can dramatically reduce our pollution and only affect the lives of a tiny proportion of people in the world who are not even made happy by the fact that their giant ocean-going cruise liner is taking them between ports in the Mediterranean. Or that they have their own private jets that take them from one sad place to another, where they can go to an exclusive restaurant and pretend they're happy. In a sense, you can be very cynical, but say, this is great. If carbon pollution wasn't so incredibly differentiated, you couldn't imagine the lives of most people in the world improving, because without a wreck the planet. But the vast majority of people on Earth are not wrecking the planet. My last slide, so please think of a question. I'll let you read those 10 commandments. These were written down 100 years ago. And they sort of failed. It's interesting. People have come up with all kinds of solutions as what we should do. But they're an alternative set of 10 commandments. They appeared on the reverse of this banner, which was in the East Bradford Socialist Sunday School. No longer exists. Beautiful banner. It's got poppies on it before the First World War began, because poppies were a sign of renewal and hope, and a rising sun and so on. And just 100 years, 110 years after this, remember 1914 was the most unequal time. We are currently again at the most unequal time. The Socialist Sunday School didn't win over hearts and minds of people. But throughout the 1920s and 30s, inequality dropped remarkably quickly. Nobody was happy. because we had a cost of living crisis. MPs had to take wage cuts, as they've had to do recently. We had mass unemployment, fears of civil unrest. The top bankers took no pay increase at all in the country. And then a war came, and out of a war we changed things further and moved from being one kind of place to another. And novelists wrote books and plays, like Brideshead Revisited that I've mentioned, or I don't know, do they still teach you in Inspector Calls? Okay, published in around about 1945, but written earlier, all about selfishness and greed and what it gets you in the 20s and 30s. And in some ways, we're back there again. We're back at the point of extreme inequality, where the money's run out, and we're having to decide what to do about it, right? And you're at exactly the right age to enjoy and watch this and take part. My grandfather, I'll end on this. My grandfather was born in 1916. Most of his life, things got better. His mother died as a result of his birth, but he didn't know. The First World War was going on, but he didn't know. He had to lend his bike to his brother to look for work in the 1930s, but that was fine. He broke the strike in 1926 as a 10-year-old on the coal barges in Murfield. He was a strike breaker. He won a place to Oxford University in 1935 and became posh. He had to go and fight in a war in 1940-41. He couldn't take the seat the Labour Party had reserved for him in 1945 because he couldn't get back from Berlin. His mate Howard Wilson could. He's always been bitter about that. He saw full employment in the 50s and 60s. He saw families being able to get a mortgage and start a family young and get a house. When he was old, the health service was so well provided for that he was phoned up and asked when he'd like an operation in his 90s. For all of my grandfather's life, things got dramatically better, because even when inequality rose, for the old it was okay. That could be your lives, except on top of that, for the UK, for those of you who stay here, you're going to go and watch a planet stabilising for the first time in the history of our species, and people of your age being seen as incredibly and increasingly valuable because there are so few of you, rather than being treated at the moment as disposable and largely unwanted, which is what we do a lot across a lot of the world at the moment. Thank you for humouring me, looking at all the graphs, and please ask any questions. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, about 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Who's brave? You can ask about anything, by the way. Almost. You can ask. I might not be allowed to answer.
If someone's got a question, go on. If not, I have. I want. Here we go.
Do you think we'll see much change under the next Labour Party?
Under the current Labour government? I suspect so, because they've run out of money. So they're going to have to do things that they might not necessarily want to do because of the situation. We can't borrow money except at high interest now. And just keeping the current system going costs more than we currently have. So I think we'll see change. And if they're clever, they'll take credit for it rather than saying they had to do it. I suspect within a year they'll bring in back child benefit for the 3rd or 4th child. 56% of children in Britain, the majority of children in Britain with a brother and a sister are going hungry 2 or 3 times a month now. So I'm sure, I can't believe that they will not bring child benefit back in. It doesn't cost very much. They're going to have to tax better off people. The only question is how honest they're going to be about it. I think it would be better to be honest and to explain the situation rather than to do it by stealth. But I'll be surprised if they don't. But you have to remember, in 2017 and 2019, we had a manifesto from the Labour Party which was said to be unworkable. It included increasing public spending in 5 years up to the level of Germany, although they didn't sell it like that. If they'd sold it like that, they might have done it slightly better. But because of the pandemic and other crises, when Boris Johnson got in, public spending increased well over what Labour had ever said. So when people tell you things aren't possible, you at least have got to look at the range of things that have happened or happened in other countries. So I suspect there's going to be a big change. But we may have people arguing that it isn't enough and it should go faster. But I could easily be wrong. And I can think of a way of selling it which would make it more palpable than pretending you're not going to do it and then do it. So Rachel Reeves has committed herself to no increases on capital gains taxes and so on. She should just say now, I'm sorry, we really can't do it. The later she says she's wrong on that, the more duplicitous she'll look and the more trust will keep on being eroded in the country.
Time for one more question.
What's my favourite part of writing them? That's a brilliant question. I do like writing books, which is odd. I didn't learn to read till I was 8. So the bit I don't like is spelling and grammar. Having to get a verb in sentences, apparently. Really annoying. The favourite part is thinking about them at the very beginning. It's what you imagine. It's deciding how to do it. It's then a slog. It's like a ridiculous amount of homework every night. Each book is the size of a PhD thesis. I'm an addict. You think you'd learn. And then it's actually a slight disappointment when it's finally published because you have to talk to people and they don't know about it, whereas you started working on it 3 or 4 years earlier. So yes, and it makes sense. Starting a book off is the favourite part, and that's why you keep on doing them, because it's fun thinking about how to do it. That's a brilliant question. Thank you very much.